recording. All right, I think we're good to go.
Okay. Your meeting.
Okay. Well, welcome. I'm so glad we can finally all be together to talk about this. It's been 2 years now, I think, since we started saying it would be good to have a workshop to talk over some wetlands items. I think we'll start by doing some introductions since we have some visitors that will be both presenting and we have some visitors that are here to observe and listen as well. So I'll just start. I'm Tina Carstens, the administrator of the Watershed District, and I'll introduce other staff and board, and then we will get into our visitors as well. Nicole, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Nicole Soderholm, the permit coordinator with the Watershed.
And then Erin, I'm going to give yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Anderson-Wenz with Bar Engineering Company. Been doing a lot of work with the Watershed for many years, and so if people have questions on past efforts with wetlands, I can answer to those.
Okay, and then let's do board members. So Larry, why don't you start?
Larry Swope, board member and president.
And Diane?
Diane Ward, I'm one of the board managers.
And Val?
Val Isel, one of the board managers.
And Cliff?
Cliff Eichinger on the board of managers.
Okay, and then our visitor presenters tonight, we have Mark Jacobson.
I'm with Bar Engineering also. I'm a wetland hydrologist or wetland scientist and hydrologist. I've worked with Ramsey-Washington a little bit over the years, off and on, not regularly, but started my career with Coon Creek Watershed District on staff there for a couple of years, and then have helped various watersheds over the years with Wetland Conservation Act administration, not so much in the past 10 years or so, but earlier on, Valley Branch and 9 Mile, Rileyburg, a bunch of the watersheds around the metro area. But now I focus more on private clients and wetland permitting.
All right, thanks, Mark. Ben Meyer.
Hi, Ben Meyer. I'm with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. I'm your state representative on the Wetland Conservation Act Technical Evaluation Panel. So I oversee the technical and administrative duties of the watershed when it comes to the state wetland rule. I've been doing wetland administration and wetland training and wetland technical work for over 20 years. So I think Mark and I bumped into each other in the past as well. So it's good to see him. So if you have any wetland questions, especially as relates to the Wetland Conservation Act, feel free to throw them at me.
Great, thanks, Ben. And then our visitors tonight, Joe Bester. Hope you're muted, so just make sure you're muted.
Hi, I'm Joe Bester, Lake Owasso Association. I'm over on the Shoreview side. Half of the lake, as you probably know, is Roseville, half in Shoreview roughly, but been on the board for a long time and just wanted to sit and observe in here and learn and observe.
Thanks, Joe. And Edward?
Hi, Larry and board members, thank you so much for putting this on. This is a wonderful opportunity. I, like Joe, am on the board of the Lake Owasso Association. I live on the lake. And many years ago, I was on the Grass Lake Water Management Board that was assumed into the Ramsey-Washington. So I have a very strong interest in this, and I just want to listen and learn. And Tina, thanks for orchestrating this.
Sure, thanks for being here. All right, so there was a packet of information, quite a few. It was a PowerPoint slides along with some links to other information. As I mentioned in the email when I sent that out, Ben from Bowser put together quite a bit of that front information regarding wetlands and the Wetland Conservation Act. And then other staff and bar staff as well put together some of the other information in the second half of that. I don't want to take up all of our time by going over that presentation unless there's a strong desire from the board to hear that presentation from Ben. I want to do what's most helpful for you. So I don't want to duplicate. I want you to use that as your background information, but if there's pieces of it, or if you think you would gain, if you'd rather hear from Ben on that data and information, we can do that as well. How would you like to handle that this evening, board members? What do you think would be most helpful to you?
Well, I'd appreciate a little overview from Ben as to
Sure.
Particularly roles and responsibilities. Some things in here that are questions, like I'm looking right now at what is a wetland? Is it here or here or here? How do we determine those things? Because we talked about that in the last meeting with respect to Grass Lake and the berm. And when does it become a wetland? When doesn't it? In my own backyard, I've had not considered to be a wetland, considered to be a wetland. So I'm interested in that. And I'm also interested in roles and responsibilities and possibilities. And what should we be doing to achieve the result, basically of preserve and protect the wetlands, which I think is our main responsibility from our 10-year plan, as well as our role as WACA administrator.
Okay, so Ben, why don't we have you start going through that presentation? We don't need to go, we can kind of breeze over some of those points, and then if there's questions from the different board members, then we can jump in and ask him questions as he goes. How's that sound?
Sure, I will go as quick as possible. I just got done the past couple months teaching a multiple 5-day classes on these topics. So I'm trying to condense it down to 43 slides, but I won't spend hopefully a minute or two on each one, but just stop me if you have a question, and I'll definitely try to go through just some of the basics, and then you can definitely ask questions. And then, Tina, if you want to monitor if somebody has a question, I totally miss it and just keep talking. As Nicole knows, I'll just keep talking and it won't stop unless somebody stops me. So do I need to share my view, or do you have it up and I just say next, or how do you want to do that, Tina?
I can bring it up if you'd like.
Okay. If you
that
don't
would
mind
be-
me. And yeah.
Yeah, let me just get it up here.
I might just look at my notes on my other screen once in a while, but.
Let's see here. Okay. All right, can everybody see that now?
Yep.
Okay, let me go to the next page. Well, here, maybe before you get started, just as a, this is the agenda that I had set up for this workshop today. The goal is to define and clarify our role and goals in the stewardship of wetlands. And so Ben here will be talking mostly first about, definitions and Wetland Conservation Act and some of the basics about wetlands and how they work. So there you go.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'll try to whip through these here pretty quick, but so basically we start off with what is a wetland, right? And I talked to many landowners over the years, and one of the educational components that we keep coming to is that wetlands aren't just these commonly recognized ones that we see all the time, with typically what you'd think of as with open water and cattails. So go ahead next. There's less recognized wetlands. You have them actually within your watershed, even in somewhat urban areas. They're wooded swamps or seasonally flooded basins. These seasonally flooded basins we see a lot of times on agricultural land. Next, please. You can have wooded wetlands, so like a seasonally floodplain forest. You can have wetlands that are dominated by different vegetation, like native vegetation, like sedge meadows, or a very common one, and especially in the metro area here in highly disturbed areas, a reed carry grass dominated wet meadow. Next, please. So although there's scientific study of wetlands, ecology and biology, delineation is what we use for regulatory purposes. And I think everybody's probably heard that term. The state rules categorize wetlands into 8 types for regulatory purposes. Essentially, it's a way that we can condense down the great diversity of wetland types within the state for regulatory purposes and kind of make it understandable. And so the slide there is there is a wetland in that photo. And the way that we do that, basically, I'll just explain that. Go ahead into the next slide, Tina. So this is kind of the basis for all of the wetland stuff. Basically, started with the Clean Water Act in 1972 and the 1987 Core Delineation Manual is what they use on the federal level, and then the state adopted that when they passed the Wetland Conservation Act in 1991. And so it basically is a scientifically and legal defensible approach. We kind of blend those two aspects together when we talk about this. So the 3 scientific methods are, in order to be a wetland, we have to have hydrology first and foremost, right? That's kind of the driving force, is where water sits on the landscape and how long it sits there. And because we have hydrology sitting on the landscape, it grows certain types of vegetation that's adapted to wet conditions. Those are called hydrophytic vegetation or hydrophytes. And then we have formation of hydric soils. And hydric soils are that kind of long-term evidence on the landscape. They can form in years or they can form in hundreds of years. And that vegetation is a kind of a medium term. We see that develop these communities, these different vegetation and wetland communities, kind of like I talked about in those couple earlier slides with some of that terminology when we talk about wet meadows or shallow marshes or things like that. And then hydrology is obviously a topic that's everybody is interested in, and that can be a really long-term thing, but it also can be short-term. It can be very fleeting on the landscape. We can see that the talk is that we've had a drought this year comparable to 1988. And really everything in between that, we've had quite a few years of high precipitation events. And so hydrology obviously is a huge force on wetlands. And so, yeah, go ahead with the next slide.
Okay.
So just a quick, there was actually a talk at the Water Resource Conference. I know one of the managers mentioned that earlier, and they talked about this, I can't remember the exact term now, something like ecosystem function or something like that. And basically we kind of divide those when we do our training into functions and values. So one of the major ones obviously is floodwater retention. That's an aerial photo of Houston, Texas after one of the hurricanes. You can see when you lose wetlands on the landscape, kind of like the little dollar bill graphic there, is less wetlands is less flood storage, and so you have these higher flood events. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Some of these other functions of wetland on the landscape are, water quality protection, and it can be as simple as a filter strip in agricultural land, or and protection of downstream water bodies too, like this lake shows. This is a photo of a lake that one of my soil and water conservation district people took out in Wright County, and it shows the blue-green algae that makes the news quite often in the metro here. Next slide, please. The slide on the left is basically shows some diversity of wetlands, and we have these lake associated wetlands that help to buffer wave action. So we're looking at natural shorelines where we don't have, mowing and riprap down to the edge of it. And so wetlands, these deeper water wetland regimes actually help with some of that shoreline protection. And then we also have wetlands. And these are some of these wetlands that don't have permanent hydrology all year round, but they then act as these natural groundwater recharge features. This is actually a photo of a wetland on the right there in your neighboring watershed in Valley Branch. That was a restored wetland that actually acts as a natural infiltration basin. So it has water, as you can see, it's kind of a mud flat looking. It has water in it early in the growing season, and then this is a fall photo and it dries out basically by the end of the year because it has a high infiltration rate. Next slide, please. And then one of the real obvious, functions that people notice too is habitat, wildlife habitat. So, whether you're a hunter or a fisher or a photographer, all of those different functions for habitat that many species utilize wetlands for at some point in their life cycle. And next, please. And then we have some of these human values where we have food and commercial uses. So we have these traditional uses like Native Americans use for wild rice. This is a commercial wild rice operation on the left. That's in Aiken County. They have these kind of separated paddy fields. And then the cranberry bog is a photo taken from Wisconsin on the right. Next, please. And then another human value is, other things that we can harvest from wetlands, such as forestry, and then just those intrinsic values like tourism and the aesthetics of it. So the different recreation. And then the other ones, Minnesota is a big hunting and fishing, and wetlands play a big role in that, obviously, as well. Next slide, please. And then I just kind of throw up some photos here, and I basically, it pose a rhetorical question here is, there's just many more functions and values, and looking at the different photos, people have different ideas what those functions and values may be, and they may be different to other people. People that live on wetlands may have that value of that aesthetic. People that recreate may have that value of the open water. If you're an amphibian, you're gonna want that function of a wetland like is on the right, which is the same wetland. It's got water in the spring when you want to lay your eggs, and then once your babies are grown, they more want that terrestrial habitat. And so those are highly functional wetlands. Those are seasonal wetlands. So it really depends on who you are and how you use those. And so that's kind of why I just leave that graphic there and kind of just pose that question. Surprisingly enough, I live in Rice Creek Watershed District, and I live on a wetland. And so when we purchased our lot, that was the value that I had, that I wanted that view and that wildlife component too. So next slide, please. So why do we talk about these why do we talk about these functions and values? It's mainly is because in Minnesota, a lot of that has been lost. And so graphic here that I'm sure some are familiar with is Anderson Craig put together this illustration on the left. It's in black and white, but I think you can still kind of see. In 1984, they put this graph together and they basically estimated the amount of wetlands essentially just after statehood, I guess it would be in the 1860s here. And so we hadn't had a huge influence of the large scale European settlement and farming yet. And you can see a lot of the dark color on the landscape are those wetlands. As opposed to on the right, where you can see where we are now, which is the 80s, is when they did this graphic. And it hasn't changed a whole lot on this scale, I would say. And when we look at regulation, we divide the state up into 3 different areas, and 2 of the main ones are the northern part of the state, which we call the greater than 80% wetlands remaining. And really where we're located in most of the metro is this less than 50% wetlands remaining. You can see that how that essentially corresponds to that Minnesota River Valley and the Red River Valley and the intensive farming and draining that took place in there. And you know, Ramsey-Washington is kind of right on that zone between the less than 50 and the greater than 80, except also it has that influence of being a highly urbanized area as well. So next slide, please. So then we talk about more about some of these, you know, loss functions and values that wetlands provide. And, you know, I would say that some of our modern problems are from past decisions, right, that none of us really have control over now, that have led to wetland loss and then loss of those functions. So examples are like local street flooding. And I think we've all seen that, especially within this watershed, that it's not just from rivers. Those are kind of the ones that make the news all the time, those seasonal flooding events. But what we've seen in years past is like Grass Lake, is these landlocked basins that have lost a lot of their storage capacity. A lot of times in those upstream natural wetland areas that used to provide that storage. Next, please. So here's an example. I'll spend a couple minutes on it because I want to illustrate kind of some of the history that we can look at and some of the offsite tools that we have available to us. This is not within your watershed. I kind of picked that purposely because I don't want to pick on anybody specifically. It's actually in Vlamo. But if you look at the photo on the left and you look at the cul-de-sac and you look at the mainly the houses on the south side of the cul-de-sac, and you see that there's a ditch or a historic stream that ran on the kind of the south part of the photo there. Now, if you look at the colors of on the photo on the right, those are soil series mapping. A lot of the soils in the country were mapped in response to the Dust Bowl in the 30s. So we've had soil mapping for most of the state for quite a while, and they do periodic updates as well. But what's really interesting is, unless you're like in a really highly urbanized area like Minneapolis and St. Paul, if we weren't developed until after the 30s or 40s, we actually have pretty good historic soil mapping that really shows us what was on the landscape for the past, you know, few thousand years. So what you can see is the red area is a soil series that is a hydric soil. So it's one of those soils that formed under prolonged periods of wetness, long enough to be called a hydric soil. And this one is classified as a muck. So anybody that kind of knows what that is, I mean, that's an organic soil. It's can be up to 51 inches thick, this specific soil series, and it's classified as very poorly drained. So the reason I bring that up is follow the boundary of that hydric soil, and it actually crosses not only into some of these people's backyards, but actually right through their houses. So these were things that I would say when some of these houses were built, definitely, you know, pre-80s, maybe pre-1970s, as people were not thinking as much about where wetlands were on the landscape and how to maybe mitigate for problems like this. So they would fill in some of these backyards. And in this specific example, this is actually what happened. Somebody filled in these yards prior to rules, and it basically caused problems downstream of people that hadn't filled in their yards. So the water had nowhere else to go in the floodplain of this stream except for into these lower backyards that hadn't been filled previously. So you can see in that kind of yellowish or tannish color is also kind of a transitional hydric soil. It's not fully hydric like the muck soil. It's actually an Isanti series, which is a sandy loam, but it's still a poorly drained soil. And the description of that soil series, that it says the water table is near the surface for most of the year. So it's interesting things that we look at now when we're reviewing housing developments or any kind of land use change is, what is the condition of the soils there now? Where are wetlands on the landscape, and kind of how can we prevent some of these problems in the future?
And
Was there a question, or I'll go to the next slide?
I just had a quick question on the soils. How much
Sure.
influence, because it didn't connect in my mind what the color coordination was, but now that you brought it up, I appreciate it better.
Sure.
How much do the soil type impact what we're responsible for and help manage in our definition, just out of curiosity?
Sure. I mean, what we look at, so I work with Nicole, and we go out and review these wetland delineations essentially when there's some kind of proposed land use change. So one of the offsite tools that the wetland delineators that are submitting these wetland delineations to the watershed district, which then I participate on that technical evaluation panel and go out and review, are these hydric soil maps. And so what we're doing is we're trying to key in on where on the landscape are wetlands remaining that can be identified using those three parameters: the soils, the vegetation, and the hydrology. And then where is the delineator marking that, contemporary boundary now of that wetland? And you can see how mainly on the south, if you look at the photo on the left, mainly on the south side of the creek or the ditch is all pretty intact wetland. It's a forested wetland type. And you can also see when they developed the property, that's where they located the storm pond. It was in the lowest part of the landscape in that hydric soil. But you can see the problem that they presented is that, they encroached quite a ways into that hydric soil. And these people in these wet years now are experiencing waterlogged backyards and actually flooding and ponding. And one of the landowners was losing a bunch of their trees and stuff too because of that. And even though the watershed district came out and cleaned a culvert on the downstream end of this ditch, it didn't really help because it's such a large wetland complex. Remember, it's, wetlands, we like to say, are like big sponges. Well, that big sponge effect is still there after all these years. It just so happens to be in some of these people's backyards. So like I said, soils are a long-term evidence on the landscape that wetlands formed here, over that long period of time. And so that's just one of the tools that we look at to look for wetlands. Now, obviously humans have manipulated the landscape through ditching and paving and filling and stuff over the years. And so the hydric soils don't necessarily reflect, what's on the landscape now. And that's why we perform those wetland delineations and review those prior to development. Does that answer your question?
It definitely does partly. I think where I always struggle is so if the wetland still exists within these residential spaces or a different habitable area, it makes me curious on if they change that particular area. I'll let you continue so I can better form my question. I think I
might answer it when I talk more about the regulatory stuff. So hang on to that and maybe ask me again a little bit later if you're still unclear.
And I think if I could just step into that red line, that's not necessarily the wetland line. I apologize for my dog. That is the hydric soil. So it still has to have the other two parameters to be considered a wetland. So that red that you're seeing is not, undevelopable or, restricting property. It's just where historically there are wetland soils. So it's not necessarily we would delineate anywhere near that line. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole.
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
I realized it was a single criteria, but it was deceptive in the way or at least how I interpreted it in terms of where our responsibilities came and went. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole.
Oh.
Jump in there if I'm getting too technical. So
I
please
had
help
a
interpret.
question
Thank
too
you.
on that.
Yeah.
If this development came up for our approval today, would we approve part of it or any of it or none of it?
So I can hang on to that question again and let me wait till I get into the regulatory component and then maybe bring that up again,
Okay,
if I could.
yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm almost there, a couple slides away. So next slide, please, Tina. Okay, so like I had mentioned a little bit, precipitation has really been on everybody's mind the past, 6, 7, 8 years. One of the main reasons was because we had been having, very high rain events and very wet years. I just showed this as contrast here is the little map of Minnesota is the drought monitor that I actually just grabbed, I think a week ago from October 12th. And you can see that much of the state, if it's colored, is still in a drought. The white areas are those that are non-drought, so southeast and southwest are not in a drought anymore. But you can see the influence that definitely the drought had this year on a lot of wetlands. The illustration, the larger map, basically is that normal annual precip. It essentially shows a long-term trend where Minnesota has quite a gradient. As my note says, there's a difference of 14 inches in precip, average precip, between extreme southeast and extreme northwest. So, hydrology is that major driving factor for wetlands. Minnesota generally is a water-rich state as well. And we kind of noticed the opposite of that this year with the droughts. That's just kind of what I wanted to make a point on that slide. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is, it's a little bit small. Maybe it's bigger on some other screens, but apologize, this is a little bit fuzzy, a little bit small, but I wanted to just kind of point out that sometimes there's questions about, well, that's not a wetland this year because there's no water, or why during certain times of the year, wetlands may not exhibit, hydrology that you can see as far as like inundation or standing water. So that there's a technical criteria in the wetland manual that talks about that you only have to have hydrology within 12 inches of the surface. And so that's actually that red dashed line on the top graphic there for 14 or more consecutive days during the growing season. So we're actually almost out of the growing season right now in the metro. We're, probably a week or two away from that, but we don't really look at winter when everything's frozen. So this is real data that we took from a wetland, and it shows a series of 6 years on this wetland, and it shows basically what I want to show is the variability that certain wetlands have. And so you can see in 2013, the beginning of the growing season, it started off actually above zero, above the blue line. So it was actually had inundation. But then later on the growing season, it actually dropped below zero, but it was still above that 12 inches. So it met that wetland hydrology criteria. 2004, it actually dropped below the 12 inches for a certain period of time, but it was still long enough, that 14 consecutive days, that it would still meet those wetland hydrology criteria. And then you can see there must have been a wet period, 16, 17, and 18, where the wetland was saturated essentially at the surface or standing water above the ground for most of those 3 years growing season. And what we do is we couple that with actual precip data. That's the graph on the bottom. And you can see that essentially the peaks are those high rain events. And this is the if you can really squint, there's little red graphs and green graphs on the bottom, and those are the individual rain events, little bar graphs coming up and down. But the blue line is that rolling total of all of those rain events. So essentially, the correlation is When you see those tall peaks, that's where this particular wetland was inundated for a certain number of times. And where you see those kind of troughs that's where you saw drier periods as it kind of rolled through the growing season. And we actually had only saturation, and in 2014 in particular, we actually had it drop below that 12-inch threshold. So my point on this is basically that certain wetlands can be very dynamic and respond more to these high frequency and longer duration precip events. And a lot of the wetlands we have in the state are these kind of pothole type wetlands with limited surface outflows, natural outflows, and they're going to basically respond to surface inputs from precip. So next slide, please.
I have a question.
Sure. Yep.
How do you work in with this the effect of humanly directed water, storm sewers, channels that are cut to direct water into the wetland to keep them out of other areas? How does that affect Bowser's look at those types of wetlands?
Yeah, so not to get too far into the weeds on some of the definition stuff, but there is a definition in the wetland manual that talks about normal circumstances. So what we look at is what are the conditions now of that wetland. We don't go back and look at, what was the wetland in the 30s when it was a completely different situation. So we look at that kind of contemporary, and actually kind of going back to that illustration where I showed the hydric soils map, and Nicole pointed out, is we're looking at what is the evidence on the landscape now of those three parameters of a wetland. So although hydrology can fluctuate, it can fluctuate day to day or season to season or year to year, for wetlands, we're really looking at that long-term evidence of those three parameters. I would say we do a better job now, definitely since the passage of the Wetland Conservation Act, when we look at those land use changes, of looking at inputs, not only from the watershed inputs from a perspective of how much water is going in there, but we're looking at, is there going to be enough water to go into wetlands to sustain them? And we're also looking at, are we changing the hydrology of the wetland that it would be detrimental? There's a whole publication about stormwater susceptibility in wetlands. And, I would encourage everybody to read that if they want more info on that. But it basically talks about certain wetlands are more susceptible to those inundation and bounce. And you can see like a cattail wetland is less susceptible than a higher quality like sedge meadow, for example. There's certain wetland communities naturally that have adapted to handle those types of events. And there's other ones that are really sensitive to different inundation and bounce. I work up in northern Anoka County on the Anoka Sand Plain, and there are wetlands there with a lot of threatened and endangered plant species that are very susceptible to that bounce and inundation from artificial events, because they've adapted obviously long-term to kind of have a certain hydrology that they've adapted to grow in. So we're really critical about looking at watershed for each individual wetland when we look at development review now. Nicole or Mark, did I miss anything on that you might want to add?
Yeah, I mean, in our rules, we have specific, that's kind of one of our reasons for rate control rules and pre-treatment rules. So protecting the quantity and quality of runoff coming from a permitted development.
I just had a quick question. You mentioned looking at current conditions, but also looking at long-term. So how do you balance that? And could you define long-term?
Yeah, so I mean, some of those tools we have are like looking at those hydric soil maps, right? So we can look at those hydric soil maps. They show that soils that developed over a long period of time. And we're basically looking at, okay, you can define where the wetland is now on the landscape with those 3 parameters. But when it comes to development is, we want to look at, the contributing area of the watershed. We want to look at what are the greater reach from areas that used to be wetland and it's been impacted by, people. So I'm trying to think of an example maybe to use, but nothing's coming to me right now.
I could jump in quick.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
I mean, particularly we're kind of on the edge of the prairie pothole region, but I mean, as Ben mentioned, there are a lot of pothole wetlands in your area. And I mean, just to accentuate those graphs he was showing earlier, some of the major wetland hydrology work that's been done, to understand how wetlands function has been done kind of in the North Dakota region and Western Minnesota by the US Geological Survey. Just one particular study they did, it was over a 17-year period, which included, like a 5-year wet cycle, 4-year drought cycle, that they were able to really document how hydrology changes in those types of wetlands, over these longer term climate cycles. And I mean, a few of the wetlands that they were monitoring, water levels changed from like 7 to 9 feet. So much more drastic than what Ben was showing there. So, you can have pretty significant fluctuations over longer periods of time. And the hydric soils are one good way. I mean, you can actually go out in the field and, I mean, if you have a wetland like that, so during a drought period, water levels are really low. You could, do soil borings up the slope and find out kind of where that historic extent of wetland occurred, based on over thousands of years that the soils developed. So just one additional story there, I guess.
Ben, let me contribute as well. I think to
Oh,
Diane's point, I think she's probably getting at more of the influence of urban development on the landscape and how do we decide between what's there now and what was there historically. So for example, we've got a lot of land in our district that was filled over time. And if you look at a current soils map, it's just called urban mixed soils. If you tried to do a wetland delineation, if you drilled down beneath those soils, you would probably find hydric soils. But if you were to do a delineation, it would probably be at the base of that current fill, rather than to the extent it used to go up slope underneath that fill. So a current delineation would be at the base, like in that development example where they had the cul-de-sac. If you were to do a delineation currently, it would probably be in the backyards of those homes, not up in the middle of the street where the hydric soils used to exist. So does that kind of answer the question? Diane?
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and and we can talk about this a little bit more later too, but I mean, we definitely do, and your engineer can answer this too, but we definitely do more sophisticated modeling, and we include wetlands in those stormwater calcs now, definitely than I think we used to. So again, I mean, I'm always looking forward. I think I had that one slide with the flooded road on it. It's we're learning from these past issues that if you take wetlands and that storage away on the landscape, we've lost that natural ability to do that. And you can kind of only, I think you can only engineer yourself out of trouble for so much until you kind of have to restore some of those natural systems. But so to switch gears here a little bit, try to keep moving here. And we can always come back to some of these if you have questions that you think of as I'm going through. But so there's definitely there's two big things that we deal with in wetlands, and one is that kind of the more the scientific background, right? What is a wetland? What are those three kind of scientific parameters that make up a wetland? What is the driving force for forming wetlands? How does hydrology move? All those different types of things. The other big one is the regulatory aspect. And you guys are an LGU, a local government unit that administers the Wetland Conservation Act. And I think it's a fairly unique state law because it's a state law that's administered by local government units. And we have, and I always never have the number right, I think there's something like 300 LGUs in the whole entire state. And I can't even remember, I think I have something like 30 of them just in the 4 counties that I cover. So it's a lot of administrative duty for those LGUs, and it's a lot of administrative oversight for the state as well. So quick little background, Wetland Conservation Act is a bipartisan bill. It was passed in 91, it became effective in 92, so it's almost 30 years old. I think it's really kind of stood the test of time. If you're interested, that's the statute and rule language. Bowser has rulemaking authority once the statute is passed. And we've had, I think, well, 2009 was our last rule revision. That's what the ratty book there is. And we've had like 4 statute changes since the 2009 rule revision, which we do need. We are technically at the governor's direction. We are in rulemaking right now. We've had an extension because of the pandemic. I think we're maybe a year or 2 out from that, but between the statute changes and our ability to update some of the rules, we also have a lot of guidance documents. So I think it's really stood the test of time as a 30-year state law. And for the most part, most of the, especially the larger developers and some of the property owners that we work with are pretty familiar with it, and it works pretty well. So next slide, please. So like I said, this, I kind of hinted at this earlier. This is a better illustration of that. We have these pre-settlement areas within the state, and you can see both Ramsey County and Washington County, which I cover both of those counties, are within that less than 50% historic wetland remaining. I also cover Anoka and Chisago County, which are kind of in that transition zone. We say there's 50 to 80% of wetlands remaining, and then the northern part of the state is the greater than 80%. And this comes into play for some of our statutes and rules. And I think I'll hint on that in a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail, but one of the major ones is when we do our wetland replacement siting. So for the most part, if we're talking about wetland replacement siting in the metro, in those kind of reddish counties, we're talking about replacing in the less than 50% part of the state. So go ahead with the next slide, please. So just a quick general outline. I'm going to give you all the entire WACA regulatory rules in like 3 slides. And so it's kind of a good basic overview. So basically, the purpose of WACA is essentially the same purpose as the Clean Water Act. It talks about a no net loss of wetlands. And it talks about increasing the quantity, quality, or biological diversity. And how do we do that? It talks about avoiding impacts. And if we can't avoid those impacts, then we replace for them. And that's just the rule citing there that's in each one of those if you care to go look that up in greater detail. So next slide, please. And then basically this is one that we probably spend the most time on educating developers and landowners, is on the scope of WACA. So Wetland Conservation Act, what it regulates and what it doesn't. So what it does regulate is the three big things here. It regulates draining of all type of wetlands, it regulates filling in all types of wetlands, and it regulates excavation in type 3, 4, or 5s wetlands. That's again kind of back to the very beginning where there's those 8 different wetland types recognized in statute and rule that we've kind of categorized all of the different wetlands down into these 8 types. And that's where it becomes important because excavation is regulated differently in different types of wetlands. And then excavation is regulated in all types of wetlands if the excavation results in fill, drainage, or conversion to a non-wetland. And the best example of that is if you can think of excavating in a wetland and it converts it either into a deep water habitat, so it's not a wetland anymore, or it converts it into another use, say like a storm pond, then that's not a wetland anymore. So next slide, please. Also important to know about the scope of Wetland Conservation Act is what it does not regulate. So there's a whole bunch of different things, categories that we call either no loss or exemptions, or they're just not within the scope of WACA. And so Wetland Conservation Act is really clear about what it does not regulate. So it does not regulate the use of wetlands for pasture and cropland, or what's considered normal farming, or noxious weed control, right? Noxious weed control is covered under Department of Ag rules, so it's not within the scope of WACA. WACA doesn't regulate incidental wetlands, so those wetlands on the landscape that although might meet all 3 of those criteria, right? Hydrology, soils, and vegetation, were created in upland areas for reasons not to create a wetland. So think about maybe a storm pond that has cattails in it, or a drainage ditch might be considered an incidental wetland. Another big distinction, Wetland Conservation Act does not cover those water bodies that are listed in the public waters inventory. So these are our larger named lakes, streams, rivers, and a lot of those larger wetlands too, those deeper wetlands. Those are covered under public waters and the Public Waters Work Program administered by the DNR. So that's a big distinction there. And then not that it really has anything to do with where we are here in the urban area, but it does not regulate peat mining. That's specifically regulated by the DNR too. So, there's pretty much 2 big entities in the state at the state level that regulate wetlands. It's the DNR and their Public Waters Program. It's the Wetland Conservation Act through those local government units. And then you could also argue there's the federal level too, right? The Army Corps of Engineers regulates those waters of the US. So next, please. So where do we all come in? So we have our local government units, and that's specifically laid out in statute of who those entities are. And it says if you're within the metro, which entities it is, there's kind of defaults. You pass resolutions essentially adopting the state law that says you're going to administer the state rule. So it can be a county, a city, a watershed district, WMO, or an SWCD. And I actually work with all of these different entities in my work areas as LGUs. The oversight is provided by the Board of Water and Soil Resources. That's essentially my role, providing that oversight and being that technical evaluation panel member. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then, like I said, the Minnesota DNR has their public waters program. The landowner and the applicant, it's kind of on them to, if you're going to go out and build a building and you go to your local zoning authority, right? If it's a city or a county or something and say, I want to build a building. Well, it's on the landowner and the applicants to say, I'm having a land use change, and that they're going to be required, to identify wetlands and go through, and I'll talk about that in a second, what the process is to permit for any impacts. And then we have private consultants and contractors that essentially perform the work of doing wetland delineations, identifying wetlands on the landscape, classifying those wetlands, getting those approved by the LGU, and then working with the landowners or the applicant and with the LGU to go through that permitting process. Next slide, please. Okay, so I try to condense a lot of the WACA review process into one slide, so I don't have to go on and on about this. But so specifically, an applicant submits an application either for a wetland boundary and type review, or maybe it's for a replacement plan where they're proposing impacts. The LGU takes those permits in. They're reviewed by the technical evaluation panel, which I'll go into a little bit more detail. We discuss the project details. We're provided photos, maps. We do an on-site review. We usually have seen the site at the wetland delineation phase when it's just raw property still and it has not been converted yet. There's straightforward types of applications, and actually, unless you have a more strict rule in your local rules or ordinances, if it's an exempt activity or no loss, it's an automatic approval. If you require it at the local level to be more restrictive, then you can review those. But if it meets an exemptions or a no loss, it's essentially a default approval on that. So the staff at the watershed takes in these requests or these applications. There's an official notice of application, comes with a comment period. It depends on the difficulty of it and how much involvement there is on commenting. I'm one of those designated commenters from the state level. There's a 15-day minimum comment period, and then Wetland Conservation Act adopted the state statute 1599, which allows for a 60 calendar day to either approve the application, to extend it, or to deny it. So it's a decision a lot like any other decision made by a local entity where it's a good law that talks about the LGU can't hold a project hostage for a long time. You have to make a decision within 60 days. So everyone kind of knows that there will be a decision made. I just had a couple notes on this slide because I just wanted to let the Board of Managers know that the LGU is, they're not just, for enforcement, and they're not just there to take in applications, but I looked at the 2020 reporting that the watershed did. Every one of the LGUs in the state, as part of administering WACA, is required to submit year-end reporting every year to Bowser, and we compile all those statistics. And so from your 2020 reporting, you had 20 landowner contacts that necessarily did not result in a formal application or decision. You had 11 wetland boundary and type decisions. You had 2 replacement plans, 9 no losses, 3 exemptions, and 2 potential violations reviewed. And of those 2 replacement plans, that the district approved a total of a little over 29,000 square feet of impact, or 0.67 acres. And then there was 2 monitoring reports completed and reviewed within the district that for ongoing monitoring of replacement wetlands within the district. So as you can see, there's kind of a lot of activity going on. I'll say, even though you are one of my smaller LGUs, you actually have quite a bit of activity. So it's a good thing to kind of keep track of that year after year of what activity is going on. So next slide, please. So like I said, there's this technical evaluation panel. We refer to it as the TEP a lot. So try not to get too jargony, but now I just threw a bunch of stuff up there. I have Bowser, SWCD, LGU. But so this is in the regulations, it talks about the TEP. And this is a recommendation body essentially to the LGU before they make decisions. Excuse me. And it is made up of Bowser, so myself, SWCD representative, which in your case is the Ramsey Conservation District, or actually Ramsey County now. It's that LGU appointee, so your staff. And then DNR staff, if it involves one of those public waters, either wetlands or the lake or a river or something, so any kind of public waters, the DNR is involved. We typically make site visits. The TEP provides guidance and assistance. We do that through this evaluation of these technical information, again, like the parameters of a wetland, or through the application of the rule. So helping interpret that rule and giving guidance. A lot of times the result is a technical findings and recommendations. The TEP doesn't make the decisions. That's you guys as the LGU, you make the decisions. But a lot of times we formalize that in these technical findings, citing rule and making sure they've gone through all the regulatory components. Next slide, please. So kind of basically, probably a regular activity that Nicole does quite often is you're taking either a question from the public or you're receiving an application. And so it's kind of a simplified process here to step through is, first of all, is it a wetland, right? So we're applying that scientific part as we're looking at those three parameters. Does it have hydrology, hydrophytic plant community, and hydric soils? So if it's a wetland, is it a regulated activity, right? Because within the scope of WACA, there's certain activities that are either exempt or qualify as a no loss and are not regulated by WACA. If the activity is regulated and it results in an impact, now does it require replacement? Because there's some of those activities that are exempt. So it means that there are actually impacts to wetlands, but under the state rule, they're exempt from replacement. Or there's activities that may qualify for a no loss. A good example of that might be sediment cleaning out of a storm pond that's a wetland. If it requires replacement, then we look at going through the regulatory process and looking at meeting a sequence, essentially, is can they avoid the wetland impacts, can they minimize, and then if they can't, how do they go about replacement? So I'm just going to quickly touch on a couple of those basic categories just to give you an idea what some of those might look like. So next slide, please. Okay, so no loss, I hinted at this a little bit. So there are actually 8 categories in rule about no loss. And basically it says there's no permanent loss or impact to a wetland from an activity. And so some of the most common ones are, it's just not a wetland, right? So like the one in the upper right there, there's no wetland present there. That's not going to involve any kind of wetland regulatory aspect. As the lower left one there, like I mentioned, certain types of wetland, if excavation is proposed, they may not require replacement. So that would be another no loss category. And like mowing vegetation or normal farming practices like the photo in the middle is not considered within the scope of WACA as an impact, so would be considered a no loss. Next slide, please. So then there's actually, this is a pretty lengthy part of rule. There's actually 8 subparts with over 19 categories that basically say wetlands can be impacted, but they're exempt from replacement. So some of these can be utility installation, which would be like a temporary impact. Could be ditch maintenance, like the photo shown there. It can be for forestry projects, which we don't deal with in the metro too much. It can be certain agricultural activities. It can be wildlife habitat improvements. These are some of those categories. And then it can be for small impacts, like the illustration there showing a driveway coming off of 2nd Street there is what is called in regulatories as de minimis. It's a legalese term for the minimum that says if you're below a certain threshold, you can, in certain areas of the state, certain wetland types, you can impact a small amount of wetland. Driveway is a perfect example for that. And you're exempt essentially from replacement. Next slide, please. I'm sure Nicole will appreciate that I showed this slide on here. And others. This is the Costco and Woodbury. So for illustrative purposes, essentially when you come to wetland replacement, so these are those proposed plans that don't meet a no loss, don't meet an exemption, and now they have to go through a sequencing analysis. And it's going to be a more rigorous review. It includes what's considered special considerations. So we have to look at threatened endangered species. We have to look at certain water quality issues. And then if it gets to it, that replacement must offset those lost functions and values of the impact. So that's going to be by some kind of replacement or mitigation, right? So that's going to either be off-site mitigation via like banking, or it's going to be on-site via creation of something that's going to offset that. And it's essentially going to be a naturally functioning wetland, not just like a stormwater feature. So next slide, please. So I've been mentioning this sequencing a little bit, and I tried not to go too much into detail because I have a slide on it. So this is kind of the big important part that actually Nicole and I spend a lot of time on, and we might have spent close to a year on this with the Costco project, is reviewing the sequencing part of the application. So sequencing, when it talks about replacement plan applications, basically is kind of this inverted triangle of importance. Is the first thing that the project has to show is that they can avoid wetland impacts. If wetland impacts can't be avoided, then they have to show how can they minimize impacts. Costco example was, can they reconfigure the shape of the building? Can they reconfigure the shape of the parking area or the number of parking stalls? Costco built a really large retaining wall on the north side of the property to minimize wetland impacts. So that was their minimization efforts. And then there was still impact. That was that green shaded area on the previous slide. So then we looked at how do you rectify those impacts? And they rectified those impacts by doing some combination of on-site mitigation, which was wetland creation, or partially purchasing some of the credits via banking for off-site replacement. And then we also look at reducing, eliminate impacts over time. So those wetlands that are remaining, and we kind of talked about this earlier, is how do we make sure that those wetlands still maintain hydrology to them, that they're maybe not encircled by curb and gutter that directs the water somewhere else. And then getting to that, replacing those unavoidable impacts, which would be maybe via banking. Next slide, please. So of course I purposely put one of the Costco alternatives as a background on this one too. But we have to consider a wide range of issues when we're looking at avoidance. So Costco did come in with an avoidance alternative. They actually had an avoidance alternative on site, and then they also had about, I think it was 15 or 16 off-site alternatives that we made them look at, is why can't you build on other properties? And I think they did a really good job with that, actually. So we look at the applicant must consider these issues, and then the TEP and the LGU has to weigh these issues through the sequencing before they make their decision. So we're looking at safety standards. We're not going to tell somebody to design an intersection or put a driveway someplace that doesn't meet safety standards, right? We're not the engineers, we're just reviewing these. It has to meet engineering standards and requirements. We're not going to tell somebody to put in a 100-foot retaining wall if that does not meet any kind of standard or engineering standard. We have to look at other rules and regulations. So are there variances? So does the city require 100 parking spots, but can you get a variance to go down to 95? And then does that avoid or minimize wetland impacts? Can you modify the scope or configuration of the building, like in the case of Costco? Are there other offsite properties that could work? And they did a pretty lengthy analysis on that. We look at the value and the function of the wetland. So back to kind of the beginning of my presentation about, we actually weigh that when we go through the sequencing. So a lot of the wetlands I deal with in other areas of the metro that I cover are farmed wetlands. So they still meet those 3 parameters, right? Hydrology, vegetation, and soils, but they've been farmed through. So they have a manipulated, essentially the number one thing is they have manipulated vegetation community because they're planted every year, but they still maintain enough of that hydrology and soils that they are classified as wetlands. We look at those as, is the function and value already decreased on those wetlands, and we might get a higher function and value if we replace for those somewhere else. And then we also look at that project definition. So what is proposed by the applicant? But actually in the rule, it says the LGU determines what the project is. So you can't go in and separate out a larger development and break it up into little pieces and say, well, that's my project, so I'm going to impact multiple wetlands. We want to look at it as a whole uniform project. That's more with like housing developments when they have multiple lots. We want to look at all phases together. Okay, next slide, please. So looking at avoidance is pretty straightforward in this example, right? It might be cheaper to put a straight line as a driveway to this house back in this, really desirable building site away from the road. But if they own this entire property that's in front of the house there's no way that we would let them do that, because what the rule says is if there's a feasible and prudent alternative, as in going around the wetlands, maybe makes the driveway a little longer and more expensive, but there is an avoidance alternative, we would not be able to approve the wetland impacts there. Next slide, please. And then a minimization example, kind of using the same driveway thing, again, kind of overly simplified just for illustrative purposes, but it might be easier for somebody to build a straight driveway, shorter distance, but it's going to impact the greater portion of that wetland, the larger area. Let's say the property is bounded, just only on what you can see. So they can't go around the wetland because they'd be going on adjacent neighbor's property. But we would look at minimization, go through the narrower part of the wetland from the road. And maybe they would actually meet that de minimis, that threshold where it's an exemption, they're impacting a wetland, but it's exempt from replacement. Next slide, please. So then there's that final step. So if they get through all of that sequencing and we get down to unavoidable impacts that are going to be permitted, we have to look at replacing those functions and values at an equal or greater level. And that's a lot of times now that's with purchasing wetland bank credits. Ratios in the state range from 1-to-1 on agricultural land and up to 4-to-1 on after the fact, or these are usually on our violations. Now, I think as Mark knows too, he's worked with other watersheds. There's some watersheds out there that have adopted replacement ratios that are higher than those minimum standards set forth by the state rule. I think I've seen as high as 9-to-1 in some cases, and those a lot of times are based on classifications of certain wetlands. So those higher quality wetlands might be required on the local level to have a higher replacement ratio if they're proposed to be impacted. And then siting is an important aspect too when it comes to replacement. I'll talk about that more on the next slide, please. So when we talk about siting for wetland replacement, it talks about where you are within the state on a pretty large scale. Originally, we talked about, and the rules on this have changed over the years. If people remember, it used to say minor watershed, and it also used to say county. That went away with a statute change. And the latest statute change in 2017, which I have to point out, basically said, if you're replacing your impacts with wetland banking, you can basically skip to number 3, and you can purchase credits within that BSA or that bank service area. As you'll notice, most of Ramsey County is within BSA 7, which is that pretty much that whole kind of the middle Mississippi River part of the state, where 8 is the lower Mississippi, and what is that? 5 is the upper part of the Mississippi. And then 6 is a lot of most of Washington County, which is the St. Croix. And so you'll see that when we're talking about wetland replacement that can't meet that priority siting as far as minor watershed or major watershed, we're going to a pretty big area. And you know, we've seen impacts within the watershed replaced in, say, you know, something like Stearns County. So this is a statewide approach to getting at mitigation at that kind of level, at that kind of larger watershed level, which was what those BSAs are. But I know it does not a lot of times address those local levels. If you're an LGU that's a watershed, it does not address that. If you're an LGU that's a county, it may not address that. So we talk about only moving to that next level when it's reasonable, practical, and environmentally beneficial. So again, if there are no banks within the minor or major watershed, or though there's no opportunities for mitigation within the minor major watershed, then we go to the BSA. And what we've seen recently in some of the BSAs that throughout the state is there's been a shortage of bank credits. And so applicants may actually have to go to number 4 there, which is moving to another BSA. They may have to pay a little bit more of an increased replacement ratio, but a lot of times it's worth it. The developers are paying that cost. But as you can see, if you go to another BSA, you're getting even further and further away from where that impact occurs. Next slide, please. So again, a one-page primer on banking, which is, you know, like an all-day presentation, but essentially banking is a private enterprise that landowners do, and they go through this process of a scoping document, an engineering document, and then this final approval, which includes construction plans, performance standards, credit allocation, and it's a decision by the local government. You know, it's a very intense process. It's usually a 2 to 4 year review process before the first credits are released for sale. We look at actions eligible for credit. So we're looking at really restoration of those kind of drained hydric soil areas. So another use for those hydric soil maps. So we're looking at where there's been wetland loss on the landscape and how to restore those. A lot of times they're in our agricultural areas, breaking tiles, plugging ditches, things like that. And that's why you'll see a lot of the banks within the state are actually in those agricultural areas and really outside of the greater metro area. Next slide, please. And part of banking and really wetland restoration as a whole is Bowser has this publication. It's a wetland restoration guide. It assists landowners and bankers in planning and the site assessment and construction and monitoring of banks. I just wanted to throw that in there. So there's a lot of resources on Bowser's website that we've put together over the last 30 years of implementing the Wetland Conservation Act and the mitigation part of that as well. Next slide, please. And so there's and technical guidance too that goes with that restoration guide, and you can see the link there. And it basically just talks about how to manage or how to restore and manage restoration sites. And these can be project specific, or they can be these banks as well. Next slide, please. And then just a quick little, I'm almost done, bear with me. getting to the home stretch here. Just a quick little primer on the on wetland restoration. So this is, you'll see this photo here, the one in the top, is kind of the pre-project where they've just stopped farming it, and it hasn't fully established. And then the one on the bottom there, you can see where there's a standing pool of water, and we have a nice kind of green ring around there of like a wet meadow plant community, and then also an upland buffer area that's not farmed to kind of protect that immediate watershed and habitat of the wetland there. And so these are things that we look at when we review proposed bank sites or any kind of mitigation. Is can a site be restored? We've really got away from, in the last 10 plus years, we've really gotten away from creation. It's still in the rules, but we're really trying to get people away from digging a hole somewhere in an upland and hoping water comes in there. We really are looking at, we want to have restoration. And again, going back to that hydric soils example, is that's one of those tools we look at is, was there historically hydric soils here? Can we restore wetland hydrology to those soils and get those plant communities back? We also look at adjacent land use. So is adjacent land use going to impact the wetland in the future? Is it going to change or modify those drainage areas? Location of ditches. So if it's a private ditch and you're at a headwaters area, it's great. You can plug the ditch. It's all within your property, and you kind of would get a site like that shown on the photo there. And looking at the soil conditions, again, those kind of hydric soils, are they low permeability and things? And is there a water quality component? Can you block a ditch at a headwaters area, and which would help clean water downstream? Next, please. So then a quick example of an urban restoration that was done years ago in Golden Valley. I actually worked on this project when I was a consultant. It's kind of an example of what you can do in a very small space. If you look at the illustration on the left, and there's kind of a brown, oh no, actually, no, it's not the brown roofed house. It's actually kind of on the left part of the screen. It's a kind of a rambler or ranch house on a diagonal right on the edge there. It's to the left of the creek. That one had periodic flooding, so much so that the city finally went in and purchased the house and tore it down. And then what resulted there is, on the right side, the photo on the right, was a wetland restoration. Basically, we showed that that house was built in the floodplain area of the creek. The floodplain, you can see on the photo on the left, on the upper right part of that, is there's actually a fairly nice intact, yes, thank you, fairly nice intact floodplain area in there. I think there was a nature area there. But through development over the years, they had filled in a lot of the other areas of the floodplain, and this house kind of took the brunt of that. And so they finally tore it down, and we designed a wetland restoration. I think it was only about 3-acre lot, so it was not a very big wetland. It was about 2.5 acres with a buffer around it. It had a little walking path and a bench. And you can see then the photo on the bottom of the screen is essentially what it looked like after it was restored. That's taken from the street, kind of looking towards the northwest. You can see it was a nice open water habitat community with a bunch of emergent vegetation and a buffer area. So that's actually Bassett Creek on the photo there. So that helped alleviate flooding through kind of a more natural process than just putting a pond in there. They'd had flooding with the road and the house and stuff. So kind of a small scale way to do some kind of urban restoration. And then the last slide, please.
Well,
So basically,
can I
oh
ask
yeah,
a quick
sorry.
question then? Sorry.
Yeah.
Who has the right to purchase the land? Is it only the city, or if you could add a mitigation like this, is it just the city who has the rights, or is it any LGU or?
Well, in this case, it was a city through a flood mitigation program. So they essentially condemned the house. and then took over ownership of the property. And the best use of it was, besides taking the house out of there, was then providing not only some flood mitigation, but providing some wetland restoration and also like a park amenity as well. So it's adjacent. I don't know if you can quite see it on the left side of the photo on the right. There's actually a trail, part of a trail system that goes through there. So it's kind of all those things weave together. So that was a city-driven process, really to address some immediate flooding needs in that neighborhood.
Can I give another example?
Sure.
Like Valley Branch Watershed District did a cooperative wetland bank project with a homeowners association. So the homeowners association maintained ownership of the land, but granted an easement to the Watershed District to develop a wetland within their association area. So there's potential beyond that. I mean, for watershed districts to do banking.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So just kind of a summary slide of the key points. If you remember my previous almost hour of discussion now, is there's essentially a technical side of wetlands. So what is a wetland? Remember, it's those three parameters. We identify the wetlands by doing a wetland delineation. And then there's the regulatory side, which, you as a watershed taking on that administrative role as the local government unit for WACA administers. So there's those different activities that are either exempt or no loss. If there is replacement, then we look at the sequencing, and then just the regulatory aspect and the things that we look at. And then I kind of talked about what the watershed's kind of 2020 workload look like as well too. So, and then my little note on the bottom. So there is oversight by Bowser and there's support by the TEP. And so, the important thing is that the watershed or an individual staff person is not making these decisions by themselves. You are, and I think you guys do a really good job with this. You're reaching out, asking for help, making sure that on difficult projects we're having those discussions with the TEP. We're documenting those in findings, because these are legal decisions that do have an impact on development and changes in land use. So we want to make sure that we go through all those steps and make sure that we're doing the technical side with the wetland delineation, and then we're also administering that regulatory side correctly. I think that's all I had on that. And then my last slide is just my contact info. So if you are going to bed tonight and you're like, oh, I had that really pressing wetland question, I think I'll send an email to Ben at midnight. I will totally get back to you sometime on that. So feel free to reach out directly to me. Obviously, usually your first point of contact is going to be Tina or Nicole, and know that usually when there's any wetland issues that are brought up in the watershed, I usually know about most of them as well. So with that, I'll just say thank you, and if you want to entertain any questions now.
This is Joe Bester. As an observer, can I pose a question here?
Sure, go ahead.
Just kind of a general question. Does the watershed or Bowser or any entity take a stab ever at trying to measure the capacity of a wetland, or how much pressure a wetland might become under with increased development nearby? And in the area that I live, it's hard not to think about Grass Lake specifically. I bike through there all the time and have seen how it's changed over the years. In fact, if you talk to the real old timers, they'll say that there was never water up there before. They used to have race cars up there. maybe 60, 70 years ago, and only every once in a while was there water up there. But if you go through there now, of course, there's, there's so much money that's been spent by BAR and the watershed to try to correct it so that it could, handle water nearby. But just, there used to not be loons up there because it's too shallow to have fish to feed, but there's actually loons that are on the lake now up there. Or I shouldn't call it a lake, but apparently it's deep enough where there's different kind of fish that are where loons survive. But anyway, I'm just, is there a measurement about the capacity of a watershed and the pressure that it's under when you have increased development?
I guess, Ben, I don't know if you, this kind of goes to another question that Larry had posed too about kind of indirect impacts to
Sure.
wetland areas. If you could talk about that.
Oh. Clicking faster than it responds. Yeah, I mean, I think actually Aaron or Mark might answer that watershed specific question more, but I guess what I'll say is that I've kind of heard a lot of those same stories about 70 years ago or whatever, especially if we compare to like the 30s or even a period in the 50s when it was really dry. I live in Hugo, and I'm not far from Onika Lake, if anybody's familiar with that. And that actually, I was told by a third generation farmer that his dad used to hay that lake. And so, I mean, a lot of our shallow lakes or these deeper wetlands, I guess I'll say it both ways, did dry out, periodically. They have these cycles, in dry years. Like if this drought continues another year or two, we might see that happen, where these systems are dynamic on their own naturally. And Onika does not have a lot of development around it yet. There's still quite a few farms around there. So that was dry during a dry period, but it's actually, the water level is fairly sustained. The good thing with that is it actually has an outlet that is, managed like a lot of our shallow lakes do. I think the Grass Lake example is just kind of from my outside view is that it's a landlocked basin that, urbanized around it, probably back during a drier period when we didn't design things for these back-to-back 100-year storm events. And we probably drained a lot of the, upland areas or upstream wetland areas that provided storage too. So we're kind of left with a compounding issue over many, many years. And, now how do we solve that? And I'll tell you that, you're not the only watershed that's dealing with that. I mean, Mark mentioned Valley Branch. Valley Branch is another watershed that has a lot of these closed systems in it. And there's, over the years, there's with the increased precip, there's roads going underwater and people's yards and things. And there was never natural outlets for these. That's just the type of system that it was. But when the wetlands decided to get wetter during a wet period, they weren't people's backyards and there weren't roads then. And so those systems could handle those fluctuations naturally without any impacts on, the landscape. We've obviously compounded that now, like with the example I showed with that hydric soil and that cul-de-sac road, is we've compounded it by kind of like we do with floodplains. We squeeze in where that water can go on the landscape. And so, part of it is now it's up to us to try to figure out where that water goes and how it can leave. And like I said, I think we do a better job, at least I want to say we do a better job in some of the watersheds that I work with now and some of the LGUs I work with now when we're looking at pure land use conversion that have wetlands on them. When we look at going from mainly like an agricultural field, like we do a lot of times in Anoka County, we're looking at those wetlands now and incorporating those into our stormwater calculations. How much water is going into them? Is it too much? Can we sustain them with how much water is going in? And then are we providing an outlet at the wetland boundary or maybe even a little bit above, so we don't drain it, because that's an impact. And so those are all the things that we have looked at now. I want to say since the Wetland Conservation Act, I don't think they were looked at too much of how these natural systems interact with the human intervention and stormwater. And so I guess I'd be curious, maybe Aaron or somebody from an more engineering standpoint might have a different kind of answer.
Right,
Oh,
Larry, did you?
Sorry, there we
Oh,
go. It was locked out. Right, so I would say, I would agree with everything that Ben just said. And in the context of all of that, when I'll speak from an engineering point of view, when we're thinking about the question of capacity, we're thinking about systems. So we're thinking about chains of wetlands and ponds and lakes, and how we can manage water to keep them below people's houses. So when we're thinking about capacity, that's the kind of hat that we have on. And Tina, does that speak to that, or is there any other, or does anyone want to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, I think from an engineering perspective. Go ahead, Cliff.
Oh, part of the question was, have we analyzed these basins for how much water they actually hold? And I think we do through our modeling.
Mm-hmm.
We actually went through each wetland system, looked at outlet levels, and estimated how much volume they hold, so that when we route a storm through the system, we actually can calculate how much will be retained and how much will discharge. Correct? Aaron?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we model, how water moves through them. If we're talking about how much water a water body should have, then from the engineering perspective, that's a question about flood control.
Yeah.
But yeah, does that answer the question?
I think so. Larry, did you have a follow-up? You're on mute. Yep.
Yeah, I'm off mute now. Yeah, that was kind of my question too, is that, when I read this all the time about wetlands, it's preserve and protect. And it's a little bit unclear to me what that means or how we take our roles in that, because what you're talking about is, urban development. I'll go along with that they put in roads, they put in things. We try to imagine how to re-manage the wetland system that we have given urban development. Specifically, what is our role in that? Do we have to go back and look at that and say, this is what the wetland should be, this is the way that we need, this is how we need to engineer it so that it maintains the functionality and the biodiversity that it had before, or do we not care? That all we care is that it's wet.
No, the whole system under the Wetland Conservation Act for almost 30 years now has established that process. Anything that is a wetland has to be preserved and protected unless it goes through this detailed permitting process that Ben described. And if you go back through the district's activities over the last almost 30 years, there's been very, very few wetland impacts. There might be a little peripheral impacts here and there, but for example, there's never in that whole time been a wetland that's been totally filled and destroyed. The preserve and protect is the guiding principle. Even before the Wetland Conservation Act, the district had a policy of no net loss, so that if there was impact to a wetland, they had to provide compensation, mitigation. And that was started, I think, probably in about 1987, because that's when the Corps of Engineers adopted a no net loss policy. And since that point, there were maybe like driveways going across or a road cutting across a corner of a wetland, but there was never wholesale destruction as there used to be, or drainage as there used to be. So I think the process that's in place now actually provides for that protection. And if you can go back years and years of our permit decisions, and you'll find very, very, very few wetland impacts.
Yeah, and that's where I think, what our future looks like at the watershed is focusing on that restoration component, because we
Yeah.
do have, this track record of preserving and protect. We still have a no net loss policy. We still, administer that Wetland Conservation Act, but how can we look at what we've lost in wetlands over the years and look at restoration?
Well, and we should say that we do have that data as well. We've done a historic identification of wetlands that existed at least back to 1945. I think we used those air photos, were the first good air photos that were available for our district. And we went through and identified every wetland that existed at that time. And there were some lost since that period up to the 80s, but we know where they used to be. And if there's no development on that site at this point, then we can consider that a potentially restorable wetland site. But there aren't very many, put it that way.
Yeah, Ben, that's one of the things, if we talk about restoration and we talk about, desiring no net loss within our watershed area, and we talk about how the WACA works with replacement and banking, we don't see that we have a lot of sites that would qualify for banking credits, right? Where we would hold a bank and people that would fill in or need replacement credits in our district could buy from the official bank. You talk a little bit about that, and like if we did restoration work, we could have our own kind of banking system, I'm assuming, to help satisfy our no net loss policy. But they would still be required under WACA to meet those replacements, correct?
So, yes, I mean, you kind of touched on a couple things there. It gets a little complicated, actually. I'm going to try to walk through it a little bit. So there's only one banking system in the state, and that's administered by Bowser. So, and I've had this question before. Other LGUs have posed it. You can't make your own mitigation and banking system unless it's separate, which would mean then an applicant would have to do both, right? And is that really fair? They'd have to meet a local standard and then the state standard. So with that said, you guys are in a tough situation, same with a lot of the more urbanized watersheds, is because when we talk about mitigation, like I said, really what we're focusing on now is restoration. We used to, and I'll admit it, when I was a consultant, I used to work on some of these projects. We would dig one hole here and one hole here. One was the stormwater basin and one was wetland mitigation. And we found out, it's kind of trial and error, that they did not have that same function as a natural wetland does, on the landscape. So really what we're looking at is this restoration component. And the difficult thing, and actually a difficult thing pretty much anywhere, not even just in urbanized areas, is that we've divided property up into such small chunks that the scale to do wetland restoration on, sometimes, even if you're trying to restore 40 acres of wetland in a rural area, it might be divided into 3 or 4 property owners. So then it becomes, how do you do that? Do you get some kind of cooperative agreement? What if one person says no? You can't really take a chunk out of a pie and then the rest of it's for credit. So to me, I think that's one of the most difficult things, is just like that Golden Valley example I had. And, there was the question poses, how do you go about that? Because if the watershed or a city or another, government entity isn't going to own that land, you have to get willing landowners. A lot of these wetland areas that are restorable are probably out there, but they're probably like within a drainage utility easement, or they're on some kind of outlot, or or within an HOA or whatever. There's some kind of ownership that makes it really prohibitive to go in there and do restoration. I think ideally, we've talked about this over the years. I've talked about this with your staff over the years. I think ideally the best way for you guys to approach something wouldn't be through a banking system. First of all, it'd probably be fairly cost prohibitive as far as land purchase. Secondly is because most of the time you're going to want to get these approved through the Corps, and really we've adopted pretty much the same policy as we have a 5-acre minimum. So anything less than 5 acres, we really don't want to look at for banking. There's kind of you can kind of see there's an economy of scale, right? You're going to plug a ditch and restore 5 acres, takes the same amount of effort as to plug a ditch and restore 50 acres. So we're kind of discouraging people from these smaller restorations that involve banking. With that said, is what you might want to have is, and I hate to use it as an example because as Nicole knows, we're very frustrated with it, but the Costco example is these developments that have property like adjacent to an existing wetland, or properties that have a partially drained wetland or something on them, where you can do this project specific. And project specific wetland replacement doesn't have to be on the site of the impact. I think that's one thing that a lot of people forget is, so, and it's not like we're going to say, Costco, we're going to force you to go buy property somewhere else in somebody's backyard to mitigate, but maybe what the watershed could do is kind of have that plan in their back pocket. So if another project came through with a 1/2 acre of impact, we have a site that's picked out somewhere that's maybe only an acre, so wouldn't qualify for banking, but it could be utilized for these project specific ones. So it's not on the books, it's not built ahead of time because that would be banking and we wouldn't allow that. But it could be used for project specific, where project specific basically says you can construct them prior to or concurrent. So if you do something concurrently, they can still do that. Again, back to the example of Costco, that's what they did is when they had equipment out there, they were building their infrastructure, but then they also constructed their mitigation at the same time. So that's a concurrent piece. Banking gets at that prior to, right? It's already approved, credits are in the bank, somebody writes a check and they withdraw those. So I've kind of given that some thought in some of these, and you're not the only watershed or the LGU that's struggling with this, is there's other watersheds and LGUs dealing with the loss of natural resources as you know, the wetlands are, not just flood storage as in, you know, I'm going to fill in a storm pond somewhere and build a new storm pond. We're actually losing a specific natural resource, and how do we replace those functions and values on the landscape? I was told by an engineer once that when they were proposing a fairly large wetland impact, you know, from a stormwater aspect, he said, well, I can actually do a better job of treating the stormwater. I can engineer our way out of that. And I said, well, but you're losing the whole point of this was a natural system that developed over thousands of years, and there's other functions that this wetland has as far as wildlife and, you know, all the other biota and stuff. And so that's the biggest struggle, right? I mean, we can, you know, a development can build a storm pond to help mitigate some of that function, right? But it's these other ones that we talk about, these natural functions and values that we lose on the landscape. And once you lose those out of your watershed, right, they're gone forever, pretty much, right? You can't mitigate those with a storm pond, or an upland for that matter, right? So I think that would maybe be the way to go, is like Cliff was talking about through some of the work that you've done, I think with BAR, is identify these areas that the next big project to come in, right? The next big Costco or whatever it is that comes in that looks like it's going to be impacting, you know, multiple, you know, not multiple acres. I don't want to go that big. We don't have a lot of those in the metro, but, you know, quite a bit of acreage is having sites picked out already that they can do project specific mitigation. I mean, we're actually thinking about that we're not thinking about it, it's in statute now. We have not promulgated the rule yet, but it's that in lieu fee program. And, you know, who is it? I'm going to forget. It's Carmar, I think, has a similar type project where they have higher replacement ratios for certain types of wetlands, you mitigate for that 2-to-1 basic minimum ratio that Bowser or WACA has set, right? Anything above that, per their rules, you can either mitigate for it, or you can pay into their own kind of in lieu fee program to pay for those other function offsets, right? So to satisfy the state rule, you may be replacing at the 2-to-1 to satisfy that, but maybe you have a high quality wetland that you want to replace those other functions. Maybe the watershed has the better ability to do that in the future with a different type of project than a specific wetland mitigation. So that would be one way to do it, and that, you know, you guys could reach out to those guys and how they do that. I know I've seen it used a couple different times with higher replacement ratios, but Aaron, go ahead and jump in if you want.
I was just going to mention to the group, some of you know this, and but I'm not sure all of you do, that a couple years ago, we did take, district and bar staff did start to look at areas where there could be some wetland restoration projects in areas that have been drained. So with that lens on, took some steps into that, and then sort of got tabled just so that we could, you know, have this workshop and more discussions. But there are some initial steps laid forth into setting up some sort of a prioritization tool on looking for restoration sites. So just know that some of that work has started, but, you know, certainly there's more discussions to be had before that would be finalized. But I wanted to remind the group that that did get started at one point.
You know, just kind of, I was involved many years ago, and I don't know if anybody, I haven't followed up on it because I'm not there anymore, but when I was working for a consulting firm, we did a wetland inventory for the city of Roseville, and they actually looked at it from not just a standpoint, but you could, not just a standpoint of a credit offset type thing for mitigation, but purely from a restoration standpoint, is what are the wetlands that we have on the landscape now, and how can we restore those resources? So if you took that one step further, like Aaron was saying, you could look at those areas that have been degraded, and could then we use those for offsets as far as mitigation. And a lot of those involved partially drained wetland systems, you know, lowered outlets, artificially lowered outlets, and they also involved a lot of areas that had invasive species. A lot of times, especially in Roseville, it was glossy buckthorn had taken over because these areas had been partially drained and allowed that to come in. So you can do a two-prong attack on those. You can remove the buckthorn, you can restore the hydrology, and then you're probably gonna get back similar system that used to be there, you know, prior to kind of humans messing that all up. So if you have anything like that out on the landscape, and again, you can bring it to a smaller scale than what we talk about through a statewide banking program. If you look at it from the standpoint of maybe more of like a local in lieu fee program, or maybe more of a project specific, kind of have it in your back pocket, right? And it's not to say, and a lot of people, a lot of developers and landowners get this kind of backwards, is just because bank credits are available or you have these restoration sites doesn't mean you still can't go through that sequencing, right? So we still have to go through avoidance. We have to go through minimization. We have to justify why we're impacting and then ultimately mitigating. So it's not a cart before the horse thing. It's you, just because there's credits available or just because you guys have a restoration area potential doesn't mean that justifies, you know, those wetland impacts. So we have a little bit of that problem in some other LGUs that already have banks established, and it's kind of like, yes, we know there's economic benefit from having development, but obviously you have to balance that with the natural resources. So certain amount of impact is allowable, but I think like Cliff said, we're not going out there wholesale and taking a 10-acre site with 5 acres of wetlands and making it a 10-acre development. That's, I mean, again, we had a lot of issues with Costco, but and we still do, but I think if you look at it purely from that sequencing standpoint of how we went through those steps, they did end up avoiding quite a bit of wetlands, and they did get down to that minimization stage. And that's really what the state law is set up to do. if a watershed or an LG wants to go a step further, those are those minimum standards. So you can always go, you know, stricter than that. Again, higher replacement ratios, buffer standards, setback standards. You know, there's all different things that LGUs have done. I had an LGU that had on their rules that said no excavation in any type of wetland without replacement. You know, so that's more strict than WACA, which says you can excavate in certain types of wetlands without replacement, as long as you're not converting to non-wetland. So there's a lot of different things out there you can think about from a local level to potentially be more restrictive in rule, but then you can also just look at a practical level too of, you know, if it's important to keep those resources and those functions and values on the landscape, is banking probably is not the best option, but are there other ways to do that? You know, maybe it's through, like Aaron was talking about, through a preliminary inventory and looking at those restoration sites, and kind of having those in, you know, in their back pocket for the next project that comes up.
How does WACA view flooding of wetlands or areas like that? I know when we were up north at a back when we used to have conferences and tours, and you could see every field that you went through was tiled. They were pumping out the water. The MAUD decided to support a resolution, which I'll have to say I was against, to use government land to dump water into when flooding occurred, because hey, the wetland it's a wetland. Who cares if you put more water into it? Ben mentioned Grass Lake, which over the years has gotten higher and higher and higher because it has been landlocked to some extent. Does it view degradation of a wetland the same way that it views drying out a wetland?
So it's a really interesting question, Larry, because the Wetland Conservation Act within the scope talks about no net loss, talks about impacts to the quality, quantity, and biological diversity, but then it goes on to say, but the impacts to the quality, quantity, and biological diversity are from those three things. They're from drainage, fill, or excavation that converts to non-wetland. So the interesting thing about WACA is it really doesn't address, unless you kind of reverse engineer the rule about the quantity, quality, and biological diversity and say that excess water affects those things. But the problem isn't, specifically in rule, which we have to follow, is it does not address excess water to a wetland. It only gets at the reverse of that, is drainage, right? So water is not considered fill, so that's not an impact. Adding excess water is not drainage, you know, it's the opposite. So it really doesn't get at really a conversion of, really what we're talking about is almost a conversion of wetland type.
Yeah.
So if we have a drier wetland type and we're converting it to a wetter wetland type, just to be kind of generic about it, is WACA really does not address that as an impact. And since it doesn't address it as an impact, then it doesn't require mitigation. So I've heard that question asked before, especially during the really wet years we've had. And unfortunately, there's no way we can regulate that excess water. Even frankly, I mean, to a high quality wetland that would be susceptible to excess water, you know, we've seen forested wetland types drown out in these really wet years. We've seen actually upland fringe areas. I think Nicole and I have been on some sites where, you know, landowners, rightly so, are upset because they're losing, you know, 50, 100-year-old red oak trees that fringe the wetland, and now they're getting drowned out. But WACA doesn't really address that excess water piece. We can address the removal of the water via drainage, you know, back to a historic condition, and make that be like a no loss that doesn't require replacement. I mean, we've done that in other cases. We've also allowed permitting of like temporary pumping or bypassing or things. And that's definitely all addressed in WACA under like a no loss provision. But that's just, it's one of those things that it's not even really a loophole. It's just really not addressed in rule because it focuses so much on the definition of impact being fill, excavation, or drainage.
Let me comment on that too. We've done a number of wetland studies and inventories over the years. One of the things we specifically looked at back in the early 2000s was the classification of a wetland in the current time compared to formerly. And that we found a number of wetlands that were impacted by stormwater drainage, but it's been from development that occurred back in the 60s and 70s. It's been a long time. But we found a number of wetlands too that really didn't change a whole lot in type and function and value, which was pretty interesting to some of us. But most of what we found in the district was kind of a conversion of a lot of low areas that probably had a small wetland pocket, and now they were a fairly large stormwater pond. But that was probably probably happened in the 70s and 80s, I would say, in that time period where the district had the philosophy of making sure we retained water and prevented flooding. At that time, the preservation of wetland functions and values wasn't on anybody's radar, really, until more of the late 80s and early 90s. So it's an interesting evolution. But the development that occurred that impacted most of our district's wetlands was development that happened a lot of even before the district was formed in 75, was development of the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, just
yeah, no, those are good insights, Cliff, because I mean, any of you familiar with Bennett Lake in Central Park in Roseville?
Yeah,
that used to be a bunch of separate small wetland basins, and now it's basically one big stormwater pond, and now they call it a lake. But if you look at the history of something like that, and that's basically was caused exactly what Cliff was talking about. It's basically caused by all that urban development around there. The water had to go somewhere. I was also involved in a wetland inventory in Egan. Egan developed quite a while ago too, and most of if you're familiar with the landscape of Egan, it's very hilly. And so you've got a lot of little low depressional basins. Almost every one of those was historically a wetland and now has a stormwater pipe in and a stormwater pipe out. They're still regulated as wetlands. So, I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing. If there's a historic wetland, just because it has a pipe coming in and a pipe going out, those are still regulated by WACA. If it was constructed in upland, then it's not. That gets at that incidental wetland that I talked about. But so, I mean, that is the kind of the issue is, yeah, definitely prior to the 70s is, again, really prior to the Clean Water Act, 1972, nobody was really thinking about those other functions and values other than really stormwater. And even in that aspect, sometimes they didn't. So, yeah.
What I get interested and probably concerned about is changing in the biodiversity of an area because of artificially changing the function of a wetland area. So you dump a lot of stormwater in, you maybe close off outlets, you don't have the right outlets to get the water out. Suddenly you got water there, changes a lot of things that, everybody these days worries about butterflies and bees. You lose a lot of that. You lose a lot of you talk about the vegetation that's there. You lose a lot of that when you change something from essentially one classification of wetland to another, just because we as human beings have done it to it. So my kind of question and where I'm going eventually is, what role should we have in trying to maintain what we have versus just letting it happen and saying, well, it's still wet and it's okay. I think you've kind of articulated the fact that the old way was it's still wet and it's okay. I'm not so sure if that's a good way to regulate things, but that's just my opinion.
I don't think we are letting that happen. Larry, it's two people talking. I don't think we are letting any of that happen personally. I think our rules and the Wetland Conservation Act really regulate all of our water system really closely. I don't think we're letting any place get more stormwater to the point where it's impacting and changing its environment. I think we've been really stable over a number of years. I mean, the climate change is affecting some areas. I don't think additional development is affecting many of those areas.
Yeah, I think I'll just take the example of Grass Lake that's changed so much in the 20 years that I've been here. And admittedly, the watershed district didn't have responsibility for it over all those 20 years. But it went from essentially just like Ben was talking about, a bunch of little ponds into a great big, literally it is a lake now. I don't know. It probably doesn't meet the technical standards of a lake, even though we call it that. But that to me is an example of how that wetland has changed, probably because of water being dumped into it that it couldn't get rid of as effectively as maybe another area could. So it has changed from that point. There's no question about it.
I think it's more of an example, as Ben talked about, of wetland systems that fluctuate dramatically over time. Because I remember when in my brief period, 30, 40 years of being here and working for the district, that lake has been dry and it's been to a flooded stage like it is now. And it's been in between several times. So its influence is a lot of annual precipitation and groundwater. And those are the two things that really impact that lake or that wetland system, because it's changed. I think water level in that system goes up and down by probably 3-4 feet from one decade to another.
Yeah, and we do have the monitoring data that can show how that is a system that fluctuates up and down really drastically. I think too, as we think about flooding or flooded wetlands or times of high precipitation, we're looking for, with the environment that we have, right, the built environment, the urban streets and houses and commercial land, that where can that water go that's safe from flood risk for structures too, right? So if we have a grass lake area, it's needed in order to protect those areas around it, in order to keep those structures from being impacted because of the past decisions that were made, like Ben was saying. But that's where that restoration piece. So if we can find other places where we can store water, and we do this through infiltration, stormwater management, and now, if we talk about the future of wetland restoration in our district, we can help kind of mitigate for those impacts that have happened over time because of that development.
I would just say too that our flood control rule within our rules is pretty stringent for floodplain fill. In fact, it's, unless a variance is granted by the board, it's no net fill. So that is trying to get at, mitigating and also preserving the amount of storage available on the landscape. I think we probably have one of the more stringent floodplain rules of the watersheds that I know of. But that's another element as far as quantity and flood storage that we're very strict on when permits come in. And again, we can't control what was done prior to our permit rules, but that's just something that we're implementing now and going forward.
Yeah, and I understand the use of wetlands in those areas for flood mitigation. My concern, I guess, is that we have a system to be able to reset the area, which we're starting to think about with the Phelan and Keller, even though they're lakes, but Phelan and Keller weirs, is how do we get our flood storage areas to be so resilient that when the next event comes, they're ready to go instead of still filled up with water. We don't have any place to put it, which is kind of like what happened a few years ago.
Was that paper that then you cited from USGS back in the was it Labaugh in 1998? Did that have any unique cautionary tales for us to help inform policy as we look forward? Or is it worth? I didn't actually look up that particular paper, but over a 17-year period, it does seem like there's quite a bit of variation that might help inform some of the future policy.
I mean, that study was a undeveloped area, so kind of studying natural wetland hydrology. Certainly didn't have an urban component to it. There could be some value in it. I can certainly share that with you if you want to look at it, see if there's anything of value. I haven't reviewed it in that context before, but there's certainly that potential.
Well, and I was curious, and I realize it's definitely not apples to apples, but I'd assume that even in a undeveloped area, there's probably the need to manage excess water, or the need to manage the watersheds, and so it just, or at least the flow of water. And I was just kind of curious if anything changes were made because of that particular paper.
Yeah, that I do not know if there was any follow-up. I think it was in a natural area that was to be just maintained that way, not without any human intervention. So I don't think that any actions were taken as a result of that study, but I could certainly look into that.
And as follow-on question, was there studies conducted similarly in an urban setting that weren't mentioned today that might be of interest?
I'm not aware of any kind of sort of long-term wetland studies that have been published. I know some watershed districts do, have some longer-term monitoring programs in wetlands, but I don't know that they publish their data. I'm not aware of any more comprehensive study. I don't know if Ben is or not.
Yeah, the only thing that comes to mind, and it's not quite relatable, is like Anoka County has maintained a monitoring well system across their district. 30 years, I think, of data. And the problem there is it's not really translatable to your watershed. It's a different type of system. It's the Anoka sand plain, so it's a lot of groundwater fed systems, shallow aquifer in the sands with organic soils. But I mean, it has some really fascinating results that they look at how natural wetlands react through precip and climate over time during that. I mean, it's quite a long period of time that they have. And we've actually used some of that data and reviewed some of that when we do review land use changes like developments. And so we can kind of put those into some models and predict how wetlands that are being avoided on the landscape, how those might still interact with groundwater, or are they dependent on some surface water inputs? Like, are they needing to have a pre-treatment stormwater basin still provide hydrology or something? So there's people looking at that. I'd say we almost look at that almost on a case-by-case basis when there's a replacement plan coming in that has wetlands, because we incorporate those into our stormwater models. but long-term in an urbanized area, I think unfortunately a lot of academia looks at natural systems. I know the University of Minnesota does a lot up in their Marcel experiment station up north. But again, those are all on natural systems. So it really hard to translate that. I think it's a great question because it's something I've been very curious about working in the metro area for over 20 years with wetlands and land use change, and especially surface water fed wetlands are obviously going to be more affected by what we do on the surface of the landscape, right? As far as impervious, curb and gutter, pipes and pond kind of stuff. Groundwater systems aren't quite affected the same way, but in these watersheds in the metro that have a lot of surface fed dependent wetlands, that's something I've been curious about for years, and we just don't, unfortunately, we just don't have the data for it. I think part of it is there's not a lot of appetite for people to do it because they're worried it's going to give them bad news and then it's going to like prevent development. And so, I mean, I struggled with that when I did LG work down in Farmington because they had a lot of surface water fed wetlands and there was a lot of proposals to bypass hydrology into ponds, and we were not addressing, again, that drainage impact. Even though it might be indirect, you're not putting a pipe right into the wetland, it's still a drainage impact by diverting water away from a surface water fed wetland. So I'm sure Nicole has heard me say this in meetings before, and I've said this in other watersheds too, is, once we determine that a wetland is really dependent on surface water flow, is we really want to, if we're going to truly avoid wetland impacts, especially long term, not just those direct immediate impacts, is we really want to maintain hydrology to those. So we want to design in some of our stormwater features to be upstream of these things, because WACA basically, like I said, it doesn't preclude you from putting water into a wetland. We want you to pre-treat it. That's per, other standards. But really maintaining hydrology to these wetlands, I think Larry was alluding to this too, is just as important for these functions and, and these values too, especially, wildlife and things like that to depend on different hydrology standards. I mean, if you really wanted to go, 2, 3, 4 steps further, and I'm not suggesting doing this because I was a consultant once and it costs a lot of money, and you might be at a point where, it's kind of too late for that. I don't mean to be a naysayer, but I worked with some cities that were, developing at the time, not fully developing kind of these, more outer ring suburbs, which funny now is they're fairly fully developed, but we would help them do wetland inventories and identify wetlands via the inventory that basically rank them, right? Like with a MinRam or some other classification system, basically generically, high, medium, low. And if they ranked high, maybe it was because their stormwater susceptibility or their high quality, plant community or something. If they ranked high, we would say for planning, those are the ones that we want to avoid, right? If they rank low, these maybe are ones that can go through the sequencing and be impacted, as long as they're replaced. But that's the kind of planning that you have to do. Really, unfortunately, you really have to do with raw land before it's been totally urbanized. And so that was a big kick about when MinRam first came into the scene, kind of especially the updated version about 20 years ago, is there was a lot of people doing like the Minnesota Land Cover Classification, the MLCCS. There was wetland inventories. And so there was a lot of cities in these outer ring suburbs that were doing a lot of natural resource planning using those tools. But the problem is in these urban watersheds that I work in now, is we're kind of stuck with what we have. And it's really hard. Now you're planning these systems on a per project basis almost. And so we can't go backwards, unfortunately, and plan on these larger citywide, watershed-wide scales that some of these communities were able to do. I think they served them really well because they were able to target greenway corridors. They were able to integrate with stormwater management. So it worked a lot better. But I think some of the steps that we've talked about is we can still think about doing on a watershed basis, like identifying these restorable areas, identifying what functions and values do we want to replace. Not all wetlands are going to have those, like I said, not all those wetlands are going to have those same functions, values. Some of them might be really just to get rid of invasive species and put stormwater into it, treated stormwater into it. That might be what it's going to be. We're probably not going to make, some kind of pristine, pre-European settlement wetland restored back within the watershed. That's probably just a reality. That's not going to happen. We try to target those on some of our banks. We try to look at a lot of, resources, say what was there prior to pre-settlement, looking at landscape position and soils and all that. But,
I was curious about, so Cliff in answering a question earlier talked about how, this is before my time, we did a stock of wetlands and where, how they were, right? With climate change progressing the way it has and the fluctuations we see, is this something that we should do on a more frequent basis? Or
no, I don't.
That much out of curiosity.
I don't think so. Go ahead, Tina.
Well, I'm just going to say, so Aaron, I don't know if you want to talk just a little bit about, so we did look at some wetlands in the Grass Lake area. Was that in 2019, 2020, 2019?
2019.
And reassess their MinRam classifications to see if the high water levels over those last several years had impacted the classifications. And Aaron, you want to just talk about that for a second?
Sure. So just, as a reminder, Karen Wold from our office looked at the wetlands throughout sort of the Grass Lake, Wetland A, Snail Lake area, and went out and reclassified them with MinRam to see what changed. And the overall wetland classification ratings didn't change. So they all stayed at Manage A, which is the highest level. I'm reading off of a slide I had over here for you. One of the other conclusions was that the wetter conditions contributed in some cases to some changes in wetland type, but not necessarily outside the range of changes expected for wetlands in the region. So there were some variations, but nothing that was out of the realm of possibility for this region. And in some cases, flooding was actually drowning out invasive plant species. So it was sort of a mixed conclusion. So there were some changes. In some cases, those changes could be seen as beneficial. In other cases, the changes could be seen as representative of some natural fluctuations in an extreme, of course. But I don't know, Mark and I discussed this study before tonight's meeting too, to see if he had any other conclusions on that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Mark.
No, I think you hit the high points.
Okay.
I want to react to the what Ben brought up of the opportunity to really go in depth and look at our wetlands in more detail. And I want to say that we actually have done that. Like I mentioned earlier, we looked at historical wetlands back from 1945. We did a complete MinRam assessment on all watershed district wetlands back in the late 90s. We'd reassessed them in the 2000 era, and that's when we came up with the wetland rule and Manage A, B, and C. So we took that information and we decided these are our most important ones. These are some of our slightly impacted ones, and Manage C is mostly impacted. And then we actually set up standards that are in excess of the WACA requirements. We set up setbacks and buffer requirements for all our wetlands. So we've done much more than many watershed districts have, and most LGUs have, in terms of our wetland management. And we have the data to go back and actually identify which wetlands used to exist that don't anymore. And that's the stuff that BAR started to look at a few years ago to identify potential restoration sites. So I just want to make the point that we have all the data we need. We've done all that analysis, and we are in a very good position to protect the wetlands we still have.
Is there, and maybe this is just my ignorance on the analysis that exists, because I'd love to see some more of that. And maybe I just need to read more into that just to inform myself. I was curious because I like the idea that Ben also was going, and you just mentioned too around the restorable areas. Have we looked at how that restorable areas overlay onto like higher flood risk areas or wetlands that have consumed or had an influx of water to target maybe high potential restorations? Or is that, Aaron, the work that you said was put on pause?
Started. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mean like when you say have we looked where there's potential restoration sites near other flooded or wetlands that have been flooded? You mean to like share the load kind of, or
or
flood
maybe
risk areas.
yeah, exactly. So
Oh, I see.
I think of things in terms of risk for my job, and so if you have a restorable set of areas that might be target, how do you prioritize them, as you were talking about before? I was just curious if that's something that is in a consumable state to help educate other like myself specifically, and maybe other members of the board for a future discussion.
Mhm. Well, I can tell you what we have pulled together right now for that effort. Right now, it's sort of a list of proposed prioritization metrics. And I think there's a spreadsheet associated with that too, where you can toggle different point values. And so that's where it sort of got left. There was some fine tuning and thinking through what those parameters should really be and what the relative weights should be. And that's of course where managers would have some input, of course. So we didn't get to that point. But we do have basically a bullet list of prioritization elements, such as things like the size of the restoration project that could happen, the credit potential. But as you heard Ben talk through, none of these areas would be big enough for official banking credit. So this would be more in terms of one of the, I can't remember what term you used, Ben, like in lieu.
Project specific replacement.
Yep, project specific. The other thing that we were looking at is ease of restoration, land ownership. Again, that was covered earlier this evening. Whether restoration could happen without flooding neighbors or existing infrastructure. So if you're bringing water back onto a property, that you're not creating a flood problem for a street or a home nearby. But then there were a lot of other points that crossed a lot of other categories, such as location in equity areas, environmental cleanup possibilities, habitat creation, partnership opportunities, and proximity to other protected lands. But your question about whether we looked at proximity to flood risk is a good one, and I'm going to double check that. So,
yeah.
And we have the 100-year inundation, GIS mapping and stuff, but I wonder too if a wetland restoration site would need to count on more consistent hydrology than a 100-year floodplain, for example.
mm-hmm.
I mean, as Larry started out being good stewards of WACA, it does seem like that dovetails nicely into ensuring conveyance and everything else with how the conversation's gone. And there's already some groundwork that started. And so I'm just trying to mentally paint a picture. Is there a next step, or maybe a revisiting of some initiatives past that might be advantageous that I just wasn't aware of?
Yeah, I think when we did the MinRam or the second MinRam assessment in the 2000s, I think right around 2005, maybe, we did look too at what changes happened, and we have that doc. I'll have to dig that out to find that document, but we did compare it to our previous assessment and looked at what percentage of wetlands change types, our classification types over time. So I can dig that out too, because I think that would be interesting. It wasn't a very high percentage of change. We saw a pretty consistent you know, if it was a high quality wetland, it continued to be a high quality wetland, and that, you know, we looked at because of the rules and the things that we had in place to protect those wetlands. So, and then we use those MinRAMs, and we didn't get to this part in the presentation, but you've seen, you know, our managed A, B, and C does go into play for our buffer requirements, right? So that's another way that we try and have some protection of our wetlands and preservation in order to provide for that habitat adjacent to wetlands and keep that habitat in place as well. And that can vary widely, again, quality, and there can be a lot of invasive species. There's a lot of factors that go into play on that too. But when we start with a solid no disturb buffer, we know that benefits, and there's a lot of studies that talk about the benefits of buffers on wetlands as well.
I guess what I heard, if I could just contribute, that I think the next step would be is to start looking at some of those potential restoration sites that Aaron mentioned, and revisit that prioritizing spreadsheet, and look more specifically at where we have opportunities.
Is there a primer, Cliff and Tina, on the previous work, so we could all start with a level playing field of knowledge going into the discussion?
It's a lot of raw data, but it's on the district website in terms of wetlands, but I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Tina, I think it's broken down into just wetland A, B, and C classifications.
Yeah, that's correct. I would have to kind of dig into where I could find, like Cliff mentioned, when we evaluated wetlands versus the 1945s. I'm not sure if that was put into a report. I'll just have to see if I can find that information.
I don't recall that it was in a report.
Yeah, it was what we used then to base our rules off of.
Right.
So I might be able to find some documents in our rulemaking processes too that talk about it, maybe even from our 2006 when we instituted kind of a whole overhaul of our rules. I know we talked about wetland buffers a lot.
Yeah, there's probably some GIS layers that could maybe be produced into more of a distributable form that people could at least see how we did it and how it laid out across the district. You know, maybe Carrie could.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those 45 wetland layer, I think she has in there. So
yeah.
You could overlay it. We could put it on a map so that you could overlay that and see the difference.
Current wetlands. Yeah.
Yeah. And Erin, you know, I don't know if in Karen's work of restoration sites, if she used that in particular, or she probably had other as well, other sources of information.
Yeah, I can look back at how that was done. And I don't know if in prep for tonight, I was looking to see if we ever did a technical memorandum, but I just don't think it got that far. So I think I can look back at what she was looking at. I know she was looking at hydric soils. So she was looking at the soil maps that Ben was talking about, and looking at these other, you know, these questions of, you know, all the things a wetland needs and to make it a wetland. So I can look back at that and, you know, package that so that board managers can take a look and we can pick it up and go from there.
Has the work that Karen did on assessing the Grass Lake area, which was added after you did the inventory, has that been integrated into all that data?
Was that, oh, her updated at MinRAM, you mean?
Yeah.
Has it been?
So she did the MinRAM on all the Grass Lake WMO wetlands in like 2013, I believe, or somewhere in there, 2013, 2014. And then when she looked in 2019, she was comparing, and there was no change in wetland classification type based on MinRAM.
And was our system updated with her new assessments?
That's a good question. I will check on that.
I don't know.
Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Well, yeah, we don't house, I think she houses all of our MinRAM. I don't know, unless Nicole, you can access our MinRAM assessments. in the office, but
Yeah, just what's available in the attribute table for the GIS. Typically, I'm just looking at management class.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know which of the attributes would have changed, but we could look into that. The management classification didn't change, so
Right.
that's still consistent.
I will say too that as an ongoing effort with our GIS technician, Carrie, when I get WACA applications and process them, very rarely do they come with a change in classification. But when those do occur, we update our own inventory. Same with, trying to be more accurate about boundaries and how
Yeah.
we draw them within the GIS. It's not with CAD, but Carrie does a good job with, trying to mimic with the actual delineation. And the consultants have all the CAD, drawings for their proposed developments. But and then also, incidental wetlands that we can remove, from the landscape, for development. But yeah.
Mhm.
so, I mean, I think I'm hearing some takeaways. There's others. There was some discussion earlier about, going above and beyond WACA. We have our buffer requirements. This pay in lieu of, or in addition to purchasing, banking, if there's some fund, kind of like our stormwater impact fund, when they can't do stormwater treatment on site, let's say they can't do restoration on their property, or they can't do mitigation on their property. Is that something the board's interested in exploring more, having some sort of cash in lieu of fund that we would use for these restoration sites?
Yeah, I think those are topics. I mean, the purpose of the workshop, at least from my point of view, is to kind of set a base with everybody.
Mhm.
And we bring this back into a regular board meeting when we
For sure.
discuss how we're gonna go with it, and if anywhere, and how we're gonna use it. So I think, at least from my point of view, I found out a lot tonight, like I did with the water conference that we had last week. So I think we're getting kind of late here, actually.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Ben, thank you so much, and Mark, for you too. Thank you very much for your insight. I think we may call you back for an encore.
The thing.
Tina just has to ask. I'm here for
Yeah.
you guys, so that's
Okay.
part of my job.
I
Got
heard,
it.
I heard Ben offer midnight. Just
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, sure,
He
anytime.
said, email him anytime. He didn't say he'd
Yeah,
respond.
email anytime. Yep. I may not reply right away, but email anytime.
Right.
No,
Well,
good. I appreciate your time as well. Thank you, Ben and Mark, and Aaron for being here tonight.
And at the next meeting, we'll have a little bit of follow-up on this, and as we move along, we'll continue to develop our role, because we're gonna have issues come up, like Victoria Shores, that we have to interact with, and it's good to know what, at least starting, what we can and we can't do as a watershed district, or specifically as a WACA administrator.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yep. Great. Well,
So
thank
is
you.
Anybody have anything else?
No.
That's it for tonight.
Okay. Thank you all so
All right.
much.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
You're
See you
welcome.
next
Bye
week.
now.